The notification that this webinar is being live streamed suggests to me that we are being live streamed, even though I'm looking at my computer and it's like, give us a minute. Okay, and now we're here and I should close this before the talk back starts. Okay. Ah, it's my favorite thing to do. And I say it because it's true. And I get to do it every month. And it's such an absolute pleasure and a joy. And I love to do it. And I was just mentioning before we got started that this is the 1 year anniversary. We've been doing this for a year now. About a year ago, we went into the sort of in-house CLAGS office and we said, what do we want our programming agenda to look like? What are the kinds of conversations we want to be a part of? What's the work we want to see and do? We landed on this series where we're bringing together people who are doing really fascinating, exciting work in the field of sort of queer of color, trans of color studies. And it is an occasion for us to sit and think and talk about that work and to celebrate that work and to sort of probe what's interesting and to explore those conversations. And it's all possible because of the work that CLAGS can do more broadly. And so before we get started tonight, I just want to take a second to talk a bit about CLAGS as an institution, as a legacy, as a thing that you should consider contributing to. And with that, I would love to welcome our executive director, Matt Brim.
Thank you, James. Joe, thanks for being here. Can't wait to hear your discussion with James. I'm Matt Brim, the Executive Director of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies. Thanks, everybody, for being with us today. I have two jobs, one of which is my favorite job, and that is to ask everyone to share CLAG's vision. And CLAG's vision is to bring free and accessible LGBTQ studies to everyone because everyone deserves it. And this is our mission. This is how we see our role in the public university system. And we appreciate your attendance, first of all, which helps you to share our vision and for us to learn about your visions. But we also appreciate your material support. And so this year we launched a capital campaign called A Different Legacy. And the vision of A Different Legacy is to upend the traditional legacy giving models in higher education, which have been in the news a lot lately. We know that traditional legacies buttress racial privilege, and they buttress socioeconomic class distinction and stratification. And here at CLAGS, we want to upend that, and we want to say, let's create a legacy where giving is linked to equity rather than elitism. If you can help us bring free, accessible LGBTQ studies to everyone by giving material support, please do so by going to clags.org. This is our website. You'll see a donate button there. We're a 501c3, so all your donations are tax deductible. And we appreciate your support, but we appreciate your attendance as well. If you can't give today, please just make a note for another day when you can give a little bit. My second happy job is to talk about two upcoming events at CLAGS. The first is on March 6th, that's 1 week from today, and that event is titled Queer Metropolis, LGBT plus placemaking in Mexico City. And that will feature Christina Chica. Christina is the CLAGS Scholar in Residence this year from UCLA. And in this talk, Christina will investigate the relationship between urban change and the LGBT plus placemaking in Mexico City, with particular emphasis on how LGBT people and organizations have adapted to COVID-19. So you'll see a link in the chat where you can click and register for that event. That is both in person and online, in person here at the Grad Center. And the second event I want to mention is going to be on March 21st at 4 p.m. And this is a combined book talk by Ramsey Fawaz and Paisley Kara. And that event is titled Class and Sex Forms. And so Ramsey and Paisley will discuss their recent books. Paisley's is Sex Is as Sex Does, Governing Transgender Identity. And Ramsey's is Queer Forms. There will be a special focus in that conversation on the class implications of these scholars' research, including the formal invention produced by queer class experience and the class-based doing of sex and gender. I'll be moderating that. Both of these events, Christina's talk and Ramsey and Paisley's book conversation, are part of CLAG's Queer Class Relations Speaker Series that we've been holding this year. I invite you to those as I invite you to all of our events. I appreciate your time, your attendance, and your material support. Thanks so much.
So many actually excited. I mean, they're great programming. I'm excited about it. I'm excited to share it. It's gonna be great, and you should absolutely participate. I want to just dive in because I won't hold you. I want to dive into the thing, but first I have to maybe just say a few words. Every time we do an event, we start from the ground up and we figure out like what is this event about and who is the perfect person for this event. And I say all that as the very long way of saying, guys, this one is my dissertation director. I'm so deeply fond of today's speaker. Like I think that in a lot of ways, if insofar as part of the impetus for this series was ideas that I like encountered in grad school and could never forget about. It feels like, he has a role in the creation of this thing we're all doing here together. And so it's just so nice to be able to invite him to the space. Who is the him? You already know, but fine. Martin Joseph, Joe, if you know, Ponce, is an associate professor of English and the academic advisor for the Sexuality Studies program. His teaching and research interests focus on Asian American, African American, and comparative U.S. ethnic literatures and cultures, queer of color critique, and queer diasporic critique, and histories and theories of U.S. empire. A former co-coordinator of the Asian American Studies program, Sexuality Studies program, and the Diversity and Identity Studies Collective, DISCO, as well as a lead co-organizer of 3 Queer Places, Practices, and Lives conferences at OSU. He's been recognized for his institutional contributions with the Asian American Studies program's Faculty Award for Service, the English Department's Marlene Longenecker Award for Teaching and Leadership, and the Arts and Humanities Diversity Enhancement Award, the Ohio State University's Distinguished Diversity Enhancement Award. He's currently pursuing 2 book projects, a transnational analysis of historiographical Asian American literature that considers how articulations of competing imperialisms, nationalisms, and desires simultaneously bolster and challenge American and Asian American exceptionalism, and a comparative analysis of queer of color literature that examines how evocations of colonial history, racial objectifications, and reclaimed homelands provide alternative worldview to the exclusions of white imperial homonormativity. Uh, I again, I'm really fond, and so I won't linger over it any longer. I give you someone I think a lot about, Martin Joseph Ponce.
Thanks very much, James. That was really generous and kind invitation and introduction. So I will just dive in as well, share my screen, and hopefully we can get to some conversation in a few minutes. So thanks again to James and to Matt Brim, who I just met, for this invitation to participate in the conversation on queer and trans of color studies, and to the Center for LGBTQ Studies for hosting the event. It's an honor and a pleasure to be part of this series. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Central Ohio, the ancestral and contemporary territory of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. Thousands of years ago, indigenous peoples made this region a center of trade, culture, and innovation in astronomy, geography, mathematics, and engineering. Today, individuals from a broad range of indigenous backgrounds call Central Ohio home, and the region continues to serve as a site of indigenous exchange, innovation, artistic expression, and scientific knowledge. My remarks today stem from a project I've been thinking about for many years, but haven't had the chance to fully pursue. James just gave a 1-sentence gloss on it. So I appreciate this opportunity to lay out some of those ideas as a way to open up conversation about queer of color studies. Broadly speaking, the goal of the project is to theorize and enact a relational queer of color reading practice, an analytic that reads queer literatures across conventionally defined racial fields. It seems to me that whatever else queer of color critique may signify, its promise lies precisely in the racially non-specific term of color, and its potential to draw connections across horizontal subject positions and literary traditions. The complications that arise when trying to do so are at the heart of my presentation today. What I'm simply calling reading queer of color literature emerges from teaching the LGBTQ literature and culture course in my department. Although I've long centered queer and trans writers of color, I started framing the course specifically around gay and lesbian literacy practices several years ago as a way to emphasize the historical primacy of reading literature and print texts of all kinds to the formation of modern gay and lesbian identities and communities. The notion that LGBTQ+ folk turn to written texts to understand their desires, sexualities, and genders, and to alleviate their sense of isolation is ubiquitous. As Jody Med writes in the introduction to the Cambridge Companion to Lesbian Literature, quote, "The literature often attracts queer readers whose private sense of gender and or sexual difference compels them toward textual companions," end quote. Similarly, Valerie Roy writes in her analysis of Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, a family tragic comic, which I will touch on in a moment, quote, "It should be no surprise that queers are liable to an intense library cathexis. What sort of people, after all, must research who they are? Those whose difference is anti-familial, somatically unmarked, culturally veiled, and potentially shaming are drawn to lonely stacks and secret research where the archive enables self-definition." She goes on to note, though, that this intense engagement with print culture, quote, "is historically specific and narrowly bounded, beginning only with the emergence of modern taxonomies of sexual identity in the last decades of the 19th century. Yet that century or so contains a rich bibliophilic tradition," end quote. As Roy demonstrates, Bechdel's 2006 graphic memoir, Fun Home, illustrates well this rich bibliophilic tradition and Alison's bookish self's passionate engagement with it. We see Alison looking up the word lesbian in the family dictionary, then reading Elsa's story in the anthology Word Is Out on the next page. She narrates later that she, quote, "realized in the campus bookstore that I was a lesbian." That first volume, Word Is Out, according to Alison, quote, "led quickly to others." And we see her buying the book Lesbian/Woman by Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, which itself, quote, "referred to other books, which I sought out in the library." In the next panels, Alison looks up homosexuality in the card catalog and remarks on the erotics of reading. Quote, "I found a 4-foot trove in the stacks, which I quickly ravished," end quote. Bechdel returns to these scenes of reading later in the memoir when her father gives her a copy of Colette's autobiography, Earthly Paradise, which she promptly adds to her growing stack of lesbian and gay books. All of this extracurricular queer reading, indulged in when she's supposed to be making her way through Ulysses for her James Joyce seminar, leads Alison to joke that she should get course credit for pursuing her own independent study. Quote, "Contemporary and historical perspectives on homosexuality would have had quite a legitimate ring." While Bechdel's queer literacy narrative is just one of many that I could point to, a quite spectacular one at that, what happens when we view the prodigious lesbian and gay bibliophilic tradition of the past century or so from the perspective of queer and trans of color critique, and its centering of racialized bodies that are in fact not somatically unmarked, indeed whose bodies are flagrantly, spectacularly marked as phenotypically colored precisely by being designated as gender sexually queer? Is the bibliographic tradition produced by and about queer and trans people of color as richly copious as its white counterpart? Writing around the time when Bechdel was in college at Oberlin, Barbara Smith voices the opposite sentiment at the end of her groundbreaking essay, Toward a Black Feminist Tradition. Quote, "I finally want to express how much easier both my waking and my sleeping hours would be if there was one book in existence that would tell me something about my life. One book based in Black feminist and Black lesbian experience, fiction or nonfiction. Just one work to reflect the reality that I and the Black women whom I love are trying to create," end quote. Rather than ravish a 4-foot trove of relevant books at the library, Smith laments the sheer absence of even one book useful and rooted in Black feminist and lesbian experience. Poet Essex Hemphill evokes a similar scenario when he goes to the library as a 6th grader in 1969. In the introduction to Brother, New Writings by Black Gay Men, he describes reading, quote, "books about homosexuality in the adult section," but notes that the books made no references to Black men that I can recall. When I finished my month-long reading marathon, he continues, I put away the last book, knowing only that I had homosexual tendencies and desires. But beyond that awareness, I didn't recognize myself in any of the material I had so exhaustively read. If anything, I could have ignorantly concluded that homosexuality was peculiar to white people. And my conclusion would have been supported by the deliberate lack of evidence concerning Black men and homosexual desire, end quote. Hemphill's library reading may have brought him knowledge of his sexuality, but nothing beyond that, nothing through which he could recognize his Black gay masculinity. To be sure, the literary landscape has changed immensely since the late 1960s and early 1980s, thanks to the efforts of writers like Smith and Hemphill and so many other queer and trans folks of color of that generation. Though one might simply point to the multitude of texts published by LGBTQ2 writers of color since then about racially inflected queer and trans experiences, I want to suggest that the interventions of queer of color critique have radically thrown into question what actually constitutes queer of color literature. Within the context of US empire and post-colonial studies broadly, queer of color critique examines how historical and contemporary processes of racialization, such as settler colonialism, transatlantic slavery, segregation, labor migration, immigration policy, urbanization, policing and surveillance, and overseas imperialism are predicated on, intertwined with, and mediated through ascriptions of gender sexual deviance. When used at all, these studies deploy the expansiveness of queer as a framework for analyzing gender sexual non-normativity broadly, moving it beyond its homosexual dimensions as a means of elucidating the ways that institutional forms of power and knowledge racialize sexuality and sexualize racial difference as a key mechanism for carrying out colonial, imperial, and capitalist domination while preserving white supremacy. Although the policies and practices by which different populations have been racialized as non-normatively gendered and sexualized shift depending on historical context and racial group, the general theoretical claim that, as scholar Keela Wazana Tompkins, glossing Roderick Ferguson, summarizes it, quote, populations of color are always and already non-heteronormative and sexually deviant, end quote, has assumed the status of a guiding tenet in the field. Insofar as racialized designations of anatomical excess, libidinal overdrive, and gender ambiguity have been used to justify racial oppressions of all kinds, peoples of color have been estranged from the US, quote, state, the nation, and citizenship itself, as Tompkins notes. Categories of belonging that are always articulated as normatively heterosexual and white. This central premise of queer of color critique, as Mark Rifkin phrases it, quote, the process by which non-white populations are defined as such involves representing them as perversely deviating from the bourgeois sexuality attributed to normative whiteness, end quote. That premise raises a host of questions that I'm grappling with and that I pose here for dialogue. The first question returns to the question of the archive and literary history. What is queer of color literature? If literature by and about people of color necessarily engages with issues of gender sexual non-normativity, is all race literature really queer literature, masquerading under a single issue category? Or does queer of color literature name only those racial texts that explicitly thematize homoerotic desires and or gender nonconformity? In that case, are we compelled to fall back on a certain identitarianism, refer more accurately to LGBT literature and culture, and drop the Q? On the other hand, if the literature challenges stereotypes of racialized sexualities, whether by asserting normative domesticity or by emphasizing that white supremacy is the cause of gender sexual deviance, wouldn't that literature necessarily appeal to a doomed politics of respectability and assimilation, thereby rendering it race literature in gender sexual whiteface, since true heteronormativity is reserved solely for whiteness? As a corollary of the first, my second question asks, if racial difference has persistently been mediated through gender sexual aberration, then is or was the reverse also true? That gender sexual deviants were racialized as or analogous to non-white others? If so, then through what discursive and social mechanisms did gay and lesbian activists and cultural workers across the 20th century seek to shed the primitivist and orientalist taint of racial inferiority that had been attached to sexual perversity in order to assert a concept of benign sexual orientation and variation? In other words, how did homosexuality and later queer become single issue categories delinked from race, such that queers of color have had to keep insisting on intersectionality at all? And to what extent do these past and present processes of becoming homonormative rest upon a constitutive, not merely interpersonal or attitudinal racism that projects the residual perversities of sexual pathology onto queer bodies of color? My third question is the converse of the previous one. To what extent does queer of color critique's key claim also provide a framework for understanding how and why the racial cultural nationalisms of the 1960s and 70s and beyond became and sometimes continue to be queerphobic and heteromasculinist? Is it possible that those phobic statements lambasting homosexuality as a white thing or a white disease say more than they know? That homosexuality in its literal sexological usage eventually did become a white thing? More broadly, to what extent has the need to cast out queerness as homoeroticism and or transgender identification from racial culture arisen precisely because of the historical link between race and gender sexual deviance? And my fourth question constitutes the bulk of my project. How have contemporary LGBTQ2 writers of color contended with these competing meanings of queerness? While the literature has registered the legacies of colonial discourse on the politics of racialized desires and the objectification of racialized bodies on the one hand, as well as the array of queer phobias stemming from various heteropatriarchal, cultural, and religious forces within racial families and communities on the other, it has also sought to reclaim, reimagine, and reinvent queer cultural histories, homelands, and practices of relationality that view homophobia and transphobia, not queerness, as a consequence of Western colonialism and imperialism. I'm happy to talk more about these manifold literary strategies in the Q&A, but one side of analysis that I would like to mention here and pursue further is the extent to which LGBTQ2 literature of color thematizes cross-racial intimacies and relationships that are neither white-colored nor same race. I know of only a handful of examples that focus on this issue, the most sustained of which is Brian Washington's 2020 novel, Memorial, which unsentimentally portrays the relationship between an African-American and a Japanese-American man in contemporary Houston. So if you know of any others, please send them my way. In sum, this project is my attempt to heed M. Jackie Alexander's call articulated in her tribute to This Bridge Called My Back, quote, to become fluent in each other's histories, including, I would add, queer histories. Doing so may provide the intellectual and ethical grounds to avoid replicating the institutional harms of racialized sexualities. As Grace Hong and Roderick Ferguson write in the introduction to Strange Affinities, the Gender and Sexual Politics of Comparative Racialization, there are, quote, moments when certain racial groups could articulate a demand for incorporation, albeit unevenly, over and against other racial groups, based on their claims to class, gender, and sexual norms of respectability, morality, and propriety, end quote. While heteronormativity and homonormativity have been used to name such efforts at claiming belonging within the dominant culture through their constricted terms of straight and queer respectability, I am also thinking of this cautionary critique in relation to indigenous studies. As Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird writes in the introduction to The Transitive Empire, Indigenous Critiques of Colonialism, the cacophony of moral claims to inclusion articulated by, quote, those people othered and abjected from the nation state's origins serves to misdirect and cloud attention from the underlying structures of settler colonialism that made the United States possible as oppressor in the first place. As a result, the cacophony produced through US colonialism and imperialism domestically and abroad often coerces struggles for social justice for queers, racial minorities, and immigrants into complicity with settler colonialism, end quote. In what ways then can a relational queer of color reading practice resist such coercions that conspire with ongoing settler colonialism, or that invest in other forms of state recognition, which end up harming some other vulnerable population? And to what extent does LGBTQ2 literature of color itself represent and model alternative modes of horizontal queer relationality across racial divides? Thank you.
My visit. Okay, I'm here. I'm visible. Um, I this is a familiar feeling of like, oh man, now I have to process that. Just it's a lot of sitting with the ideas and thinking through them. The way this works is we open the floor to questions, and the first question is always mine, and that question is the same for everyone. And it is, in what way does queer of color critique show up in your work? That feels not useful here. So maybe I want to ask a different question, which is like, and I guess it is selfishly the same question I've been thinking through for about a year now. Why the literary, right? Like, I guess what I'm trying to unpack, right, is like, what seems so interesting and so vital is the way in which, like, what's so generative about this history you've laid out is that, like, there's this effort by queer people and people of color to sort of insist ourselves into a genealogy that otherwise doesn't include us. But I guess I'm still left wondering, like, in a world where people read less and less and less, and like literature maybe isn't the way we circulate the ideas that are the hardest to like digest, like what is the value in the literary as an approach to the place to locate this concern?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So that was part of the reason why I started with teaching, because I'm in an English department and I teach literature. And so when I start with Alison Bechdel and these ideas around reading for self-definition, reading for self-understanding, I ask them, to what extent does this hold true? I had to cut a piece of the quotation from Valerie Roy's like brilliant essay on Alison Bechdel, where she says that century or so bibliophilic tradition is changing because of the internet. And so when I ask my students, like, do you read, do you seek out texts like books, or do you just turn to the internet? Do you turn to film? Do you turn to popular culture of all kinds, music? Many of them do, and they say yes, like TikTok and that sort of thing. But they haven't abandoned the literary either. I mean, they're English majors, right? So they're in my class, and they know that they're going to get stuck reading books. So that's part of it. Also, I just think there are contemporary writers of color who are writing books, and they're worth reading and they're interesting. And so I kind of think of this as an intellectual division of labor. There are some brilliant people out there who have written excellent work on visual culture and performance in particular in this area. And I'm happy that that work exists. I'm happy that cultural production exists. But I do think that literary studies scholars and literary historians haven't mapped out the field, I think, that is actually out there, and that is worth doing as well. So I don't see anything in particular that's like special about the literary of addressing the theoretical question. I just see it as part of the cultural production that's out there and that we could learn from and pay attention to.
All right, I'll open the floor. Other people, ask the questions you have.
So while we're waiting for folks to put their questions in the Q&A, I have a kind of a question that was inspired by James's, and that is, what is it about why focus on the contemporary when they're like people have expressed a lack of the genealogy of like queer of color literary examples. Is there something? Is that a choice that has to do with, you know, just personal interest, or is there something about looking to the very most contemporary texts and how they treat queer of color relationality and subjectivity?
Yeah, thank you for that. No, it's not because I think there's anything special about the contemporary. It's that, as far as I know, that's where the most identifiable archive exists, at least as far as literary texts go. So when I was asking the question, what is queer of color literature? What I was also asking is, how far back does it go? And how do we decide what belongs in a, let's just say, pre-Stonewall literary tradition that deals with homoerotic desires and or transgender identification? So the examples that I was thinking of and that I actually do teach, or one of them I teach, is Nella Larson's Passing, 1929, Harlem Renaissance text. Lots of people have read it through a queer lens. Does that belong in a African-American, lesbian, and gay literary tradition? Roderick Ferguson, I think, asks this question about Toni Morrison's Sula, based on Barbara Smith's reading of it. So I think that I think it's just some, part of it is just that it's not easy to identify what belongs in that genealogy before, yeah, let's say the 1970s and 80s, when self-identified writers are writing self-identified books in this rubric. And I also think that there's like a strong historiographical, again, impulse in some of the literature that is from the 1990s forward. And that goes back to these histories of colonial racialization and gender sexualization. And so we can learn kind of history through those literary texts, even if they are written in the contemporary moment, they're about the past.
I'm unmuted. Laura, do you want to read the question, or I can read the question? I also have another question. Whatever works for you works for me.
You go ahead and read the question in the chat from Matt Brim.
We've got a question in the chat from Matt, and I have received a note from my mother that I've talked too quickly, so I'm going to slow this one way down. I'd like to hear more about the singularity of Brian Washington's novel Memorial, because even if there are other examples out there, it feels nevertheless like the literary is woefully insufficient. How do you think about this?
I'm not sure what. If the literary means the literary landscape or the literary, I'm assuming that doesn't mean in Washington's novel. I think the novel itself.
Perhaps Matt could clarify if you want that clarification. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I didn't mean the literary landscape. Just, you know, the world of books that we read. It seems, if we can even think of a few, that seems crazy, right? That we can name a few. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's different in other media. I suspect it is. Maybe there are other people on this call that can chime in with some examples that they know of. I mean, I just stumbled across Memorial. I think I read a book review of it in the newspaper, and then like, oh, and it was only in passing that they said the protagonist is African American and Japanese American. It wasn't like, oh, and this is such an unusual thing. But to me, it was. And when I first started reading it, it was told through the first person perspective of Benson, who's the African American narrator of the first third. And then I thought, okay, well, it's going to be a Black gay novel with a Japanese American partner. Well, he gets the middle third told to the first person, the Japanese American partner. From Japan, by the way, in Osaka. And so and then it goes back to Benson in the last third. I mean, so it's not, it's much more reciprocal in that sense than simply a one-sided perspective, and then I have a partner on the side. I haven't had a chance to go through the whole thing, but one of the things that intrigued me about the novel too, in this context of thinking about Jackie Alexander's becoming fluent in each other's histories, is that every once in a while they'll talk about their own personal backgrounds. Like they're very, again, very unsentimental kind of novel. But you get a little bit of their sort of racial experiences because of that. And they kind of blow it off. They don't want it to be too, touchy-feely. But those parts are really interesting to me because it does actually speak to the reticence of even wanting to bring up race across a racial difference that is both non-white.
Okay, I'll read the next one. So we have a question from our YouTube live stream viewer who asks, as a professor and researcher on Asian American literature and culture, how do you see the impact of the purposeful emasculation of Asian men by colonialists, on their ability to experience their masculinity?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's been taken up a lot in gay and queer Asian American studies. I think it has had a very detrimental impact on the way that many Asian American, particularly men, perceive their own masculinity, particularly in relationship to other racialized people's masculinities. I do think it's also worth pointing out that those histories and stereotypes often stem from specifically Chinese American history. They did get mapped onto other Asian ethnic racialized bodies later. But there are also, from the early part of the 20th century, for example, stereotypes of Asian men as sexual predators and hypermasculine figures. This is particularly true of the Filipino male laborers came in the 1920s and early 30s, and also South Asian men who were mostly Sikh, who were also regarded as threats to white women and white boys. So there is, I would say, a great deal of ambivalence and ambiguity around Asian masculinities. But it is true that the stereotype, the general stereotype of emasculation has certainly impacted Asian and Asian American masculine subjectivities.
You're muted, James.
I'm muted. That's what happened there. I understood what was happening. It was just me pointing out that I was really excited about how deep and interesting and helpful that history was. And also that we have another question that I'm happy to read, or Laura, you can read. I have no preference.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Joe, for this terrific and illuminating lesson. I feel like a student again in the best way. Going back to James's initial question, and also the point about how I talk too fast, about the literary, I wonder about the significance of literature as a slow medium relative to other artistic cultural mediums. It takes a lot of patience with literature, and also literature is so quiet, literally and also metaphorically. What significance does literature, as in some ways uniquely slow, patient, and quiet expressive form, have for queer of color audiences? Also, hi, Joe. That's from Steph.
Hi, Steph. Thanks so much for attending and for the insightful question. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are people who have talked about reading or methods of reading called slow reading, as opposed to whatever, speed reading, I suppose. And I do think that it requires patience and self-reflection. For me, it also requires multiple readings. And so a kind of recursive looking for insights that aren't immediately visible. I mean, I don't want to get too hokey about this, but I had thought of literacy practices in this. This might be a holdover from my graduate school days, trying to justify what on earth I was doing most of my waking hours, which was basically reading and writing, and then read the late Foucault on technology of the self, and I forgot the other philosopher who explicates it in terms of philosophy as a way of life. But I do think that there's something about the meditative that comes with the literary or just reading words that is useful for this kind of exercise. I would also say that compared to the visual, which I have all kinds of respect for the people who do it because I don't have that literacy at all. When we're talking about queer of color and trans of color and colonial racialization, the visual then becomes all the more immediate and in your face. And the ethical issues of representation and reinscriptions of violence and repetitions of violence, like those I think become even more profound. And there's something about literature as text and black marks on a piece of paper. It doesn't evade those questions, but it puts them in a different light. And I think that when we talk about the politics of representation and objectification and spectacularization in literature, it is different. I'm not saying, again, that it makes it somehow excusable or easier, but there is something about having to exercise one's imagination in order to picture any of those things that are happening in the text, good or bad, erotic or violent, that is different from some of these other mediums.
We have another question in the chat from Mick. It says, I'm wondering how you understand queer of color in relation to the US national borders. Specifically, does queer of color only refer to queer people of color within the US nation state, or all those, as Jian Chen puts it, within, quote, radically different yet interrelated transnational US histories and systems of genocide, captivity, colonization, and imperialism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I had yeah, I can see it. Yep.
Oh, do you want to see the question? It's under, if you click answered, it's there now. Do you see the little tabs?
No,
rather
but
than
it's
okay.
It's okay. No, I was just thinking that whether Jian Chen had put in U.S. transnational empire and colonialism, et cetera.
Transnational U.S. histories. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No. Absolutely. That for sure. I can accept that. I mean, I am focusing on U.S. based or some attachment to North America and their writings. But I don't think that queer of color only makes sense within the confines of the contiguous 48 states and or Alaska and Hawaii. I do think that the transnational impact of US empire and globalization makes queer of color an important tool for understanding those histories, as well as European colonialism writ large. So, I mean, I guess the simplest way to answer that one is just to say, I think that's what queer diasporic critique is really trying to get at, is to understand racialization, not simply within the context of the US domestic sphere or nation state, but also its impacts abroad. And that does raise even corollary questions and contexts around exceptionalisms again, where do we see sexuality and genders being supposedly more free or more tolerant, and where do we see them as being more restricted or repressed? Those kinds of global binary stereotypes then start to bleed into the way that we understand the queerness of those populations and societies.
I'm not muted, and I'm just going to read this one. From a CLAGS board member, Julie Enzer. Hello, welcome. I'm musing about interracial relationships in queer lit. There are a good number of examples of this in lesbian genre fiction, Nikki Baker, published by Naiad Press, for instance, but other examples from more literary writers. I think, of course, of Loving Her by Anne Allen Shockley. More recently, Gabby Rivera, Julia Takes a Breath, and a great underrated novel by Gwendolyn Bicus, which I cannot recall the name of. So yeah, which is there a difference between gay male and lesbian lit?
Thank you for the question. I was hoping I wouldn't get this one. Because obviously I don't think so in a kind of essentialist way or an identitarian way, but in a literary historical way, I think there is. I had written a different epilogue to my first book where I tried to tease this out, where I looked toward women of color feminism from the 1970s and 80s. This Bridge Called My Back, multiracial, and its follow-ups are all multiracial and multicultural. I don't necessarily see the same things happening in gay male cultures of color or literary histories of color within a single text or even within anthologies. Most of, maybe this is, I don't even know if this is empirically true, but nothing jumps out in my head. And so I'm not quite sure why that is, but that is part of the reason that I'm proposing this very aspirational project, which is to say much of the research is not done on it. So I really appreciate the references that you're offering me, because I don't see that happening. And I do see the kind of reproduction of racialized stereotypes and sexualities happening even more explicitly in gay male culture, maybe than in lesbian culture. Again, sounds very reductive and essentialist, but that's just kind of my impression, that the white-centered gay male often kind of becomes the primary thing that people have to deal with, as opposed to minor relationships.
I want to point out before we move on to the other question that Julie did respond to say, I wonder how much the Mapplethorpe Isaac Julian critique in the 80s shaped the production of lit by gay men of color. And that seems interesting and worth considering. Thank you.
I think this is a great next question from Deborah. Asks, you mentioned some of the challenges of considering a variety of racial backgrounds under the rubric of queer of color. What about the variety of genders within that rubric? You started to develop this with your answer to Asian American masculinity, but what about trans experience in particular? What are the limitations, if any, of using a queer of color critique in terms of trans or gender nonconforming people of color?
Thank you, Deborah, for your question. Yeah, well, thankfully, there's a growing body of work in trans of color critique and analysis. And so I do kind of think of this a little bit in terms of another intellectual division of labor. I wish I knew the history of the relationship between gender inversion, homosexuality, and transgender identity as those categories intersect with race. Deborah, you're the sexology expert, so I'll hopefully ask you about it later. But that's kind of my impression of where that question is headed, at least as far as trans goes. Femininity and femme, I think, is part of the question that was asked earlier. So I'm thinking of this in terms of where I think everybody goes, which is Hortense Spiller's classic essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, and the ungendering of enslaved African bodies through the transatlantic slave trade. And then that undifferentiated gender division and roles having a great deal of impact on the way that we understand the construction of the binary gender system and its racialization as white. I'm thinking of C. Riley Snorton's work in this regard as well, or someone like Siobhan Somerville's idea that the less differentiated the genders are in a single person's body, the more likely they are to be understood as racially regressive on the evolutionary scale. So how all of that plays out later in contemporary or subsequent queer of color, trans of color literary history, I'm not sure. I don't have a ton of examples that come straight to mind, but we can talk about it more in the future.
Okay, before we get to the last question, I want to ask the question that I've been thinking about for the last hour, which is the always already question, which is like uses this thing that I think about all the time that I'm thinking newly about, which is like, and so maybe this is the place where I get to hold your feet to the fire and just have you tell me the answer, which is like, okay, so but does it mean that all ethnic literature is always already queer? And if so, what then are the implications for mapping out a genealogy of queer literature as distinct from ethnic literature in America?
Yeah, I mean that's my main question, James. I don't actually know the answer to it. The way that I've decided to contend with it is to look at the literature and see how the literature contends with it. By which I mean looking at examples where you have multiple kinds of queernesses going on in the text, and then taking a biopolitical approach to understanding how those different queernesses are being valued or devalued. As opposed to saying, well, that's the real queerness, right? Or because it's like homoerotic or whatever. And then this is the racialized sexuality, which is the colonial subjection or racial objectification. As contemporary artists have pointed out and shown, those things start to get imbricated very quickly and sometimes get revalued, not just understood as denigrated signs of violence and oppression. So yeah, my question really is meant to be a little bit facetious and not, well, yeah, deliberately provocative in the sense that like try to imagine the straightest race text that you can think of, and then say, well, is it still queer in a way?
I guess what I'm struggling with is that I have imagined the straight, like I'm thinking of Soul on Ice, right? Like I'm thinking of the straightest race text I could think of, and it's like it's very queer. Like if I think the reading works.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got other questions other people asked, so I'm gonna read them to you.
Sure.
Laura, go.
Okay, I'm going to read one from the Q&A section. I'm curious if you've taught a class that compares and analyzes Asian American queer and Black queer. I feel like I haven't seen much yet. I would also like to ask about what methodologies you use to compare these different queer of colors, if you do, in your classes or research. And they note this question just popped up to me after listening to your first part of the lecture. There's so many queer of color, and would it be helpful for us if we compare and contrast different colors.
Yes, thank you. So that methodology, how do we do relationality, or what some people call comparative, but have a problem with comparing things that seem like discrete, separate categories? That is at the heart of this project, and I don't have really worked out solid answers yet. What I've come up with is trying to just sort of map out some of the shared similar strategies that writers from different racial literary traditions are using to combat those twin forces of racialized sexuality on the one hand and queer phobias on the other. And so sometimes that means looking to past histories and saying, we've always been here. This is not a corruption. This is not an imposition because of Western or American colonialism. That's the native perspective in some ways. Or there's the queering of the neo-slave narrative in some examples, or the queering of labor migrations, Asian labor migrations and indentured servitude. So I see those as kind of shared strategies. Do they actually link those? Not always. In fact, probably not very often. The literature itself shows the overlaps. But that's the way that I try to bring those different kinds of literary traditions together in the classroom. So yes, actually, when I first started teaching the course that I mentioned, it was specifically on African American and Asian American literary history, because those were the only two that I knew. That was 18 years ago. So I've learned a little bit since then. But yeah, that was the way I focused it. And some of it was around the kinds of questions that we've been talking about, which is like, how are these bodies racialized in terms of gender, in particular, in terms of masculinity, as the question was asked earlier, the hypermasculinity of African-American men, for example, or African-American women when it comes to hypersexuality, or undersexed, emasculated Asian men. So there are comparisons to be made and contrasts to be made. I do think that the comparative approach, though, does risk essentializing in some ways and reifying these categories. And that's part of the reason why I'm really thinking hard about what relationality in this project means.
They add that, thank you, this was very helpful for me. I think this work of relationality / linking would help us think queer of color differently, not just comparing with white queer.
I agree, thank you.
I'm gonna so hard pivot for our last question. I'm excited about it. Do you think having to come out, as in announce your sexuality, your sexual orientation publicly when you're not straight, is a way of purposefully othering? If yes, how? If no, how?
An othering of oneself, the person who comes out? Is that the way you understand it? Okay.
Let's say yes.
Okay. So anytime I think about or talk about coming out, I'm just going to invoke somebody else and not myself. I always go to this essay by Samuel Delany, African-American sci-fi writer, called Coming/Out. And he historicizes the practice. I'm just going to do my little teacher thing here. In relationship to the debutante idea of coming out, young women coming out into society. And he says in the 50s and 60s, that is before Stonewall, one came out into homosexual society, as he called it. It was your entry into a society, entry into a subculture. It wasn't articulated towards straight people. Like, straight people need to know who's queer and who's not. That turns out to be a mechanism of surveillance, according to Delany. The other one is a mechanism for community building and welcoming new members into this subculture. So if you think of coming out as self-othering because you're coming out in front of straight people, then yes, that's what happens. But if you think about coming out as coming into a society of other, I don't know, just queers, I guess, or trans people, then no, I think it's about a kind of implicit form of address where you have an entree into shared community.
Well handled. Before we head out, you have to tell me, what are you reading? What should we be reading?
Oh gosh. I honestly don't know.
That is the correct answer.
Everything. Just read everything there is to read.
Well, I have a better recommendation, which is that if you head to bookshop.org/shop/clags, you're going to find a bunch of things to read. And it is a collection of things like Beyond the Nation, and things like, like all the things you might want to conceivably read that are just like great texts by brilliant people that'll open your mind and change the way you see the world. And if you buy them from bookshop.org, you're supporting a B Corp because Bookshop's great. You're also, like supporting Clags, so we'll take that too. And that is great. I love this. I love doing this. I love it so much. I'm going to do it again next month. So I will see all of you here on Thursday, March 16th with Renyo Huang, and we are just going to take it from the top. Nope, it's a 14th. Thursday is the 14th of March, and I know that because I'm the one who will be there. And then we're going to do it again in April, and I will send all the information so you have all the things you need to be as excited as I am about the continuing of our series. All the ideas. Thank you so much for being here. It feels so good to share the space. If you have some time and some energy and some money, donate to clags.org, and we will see you all here next month. Thank you so much.